Good afternoon and welcome to People Making Money. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we are here every Wednesday at 12:30 p.m. Pacific time, 3:30 p.m. Eastern time. This is the show with the easiest, transition. But an easiest transition in the times from, Pacific to West to East Coast. Anyway, it's, private joke. You all know my sense of humor basically doesn't exist, but I amuse myself, I suppose. Anyway, welcome. Thank you for being here. So as I kick off today's show, I'm reminded of a line from I think it's an old Woody Allen movie about the ultimate boredom being stuck in an elevator with a life insurance salesman or something like that. and oh gosh, now that I'm sorry, something resonated when I said that. And indeed, I've been watching old episodes of the television show Wings that was very popular in the 1990s. And there's an opening to an episode where Brian, the sort of more wacky of the two brothers who run the airline, is flying with just one guy in the plane, and the guy is an insurance salesman, and he's going on and on and on about insurance, and Brian periodically pretends to fall asleep and the plane takes a dive and the guy freaks out, and Brian wakes up and he rights the plane. And look, insurance is it can be a very boring subject. It's certainly dealing with the types of issues that are, shall we say, something less than pleasant in all circumstances, right? I mean, aside from the fact that when something bad happens, we're typically glad we have insurance to help us. I think we would agree that we just rather the bad things didn't happen, right? But the reality of life is bad things happen from time to time. And so we need to have insurance in order to make sure that those bad things do not damage us financially or do not damage us worse than they otherwise would have if we didn't have insurance. So I'm going to go through the various types of insurance for an individual or family. Okay. I'm not going to be talking about insurance on investments like real estate. I mean, there are similarities, of course, but it's really a different topic, and one that would probably really require a show of its own, or at least a good portion of a show of its own. Okay. And I'm not going to get into business insurance either. Okay. Again, that's a separate category, if you will. There's a lot of other types of issues that come up with a business that wouldn't apply to an individual, and in some cases, vice versa. Okay. And also, of course, you've got a range of size of businesses and such. So that all makes it much more complicated. So we're going to focus on insurance for individuals and families. Now, if you have an insurance agent or you've met an insurance agent, oftentimes they will tell you about all these numerous coverages that you need. That may or may not be the case. And the reality is each of us has our own situation, and depending on what that is, that will dictate, if you will, what types of insurance coverage we need to consider carrying. Okay. Now, here's the reality of the situation. There may be types of insurance that it would be wise for you to have, and you may not be able to afford them. And so you're going to have to go uninsured in those areas. Okay. And by the way, that's the reality for a lot of people. Okay. I mean, I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it is a thing. So part of what I hope to help you with today is to understand what types of coverages you may need and what types of coverages you don't need to worry about, okay? And which ones may be more important for you to focus on, especially if you have limited financial resources or you're in a financial rebuilding phase or something like that, where, you can't spend, as I used to joke when I was in business, a month's income on the various types of insurance that you need. Okay, so I prepared a little PowerPoint to do this because I think it's a little bit easier to see some of these terms, as we go through them. Okay, so and this is really it. What insurance do you need? Now, as always, I'm giving you general information. This is not meant to be a specific insurance review for you as an individual. That's something you need to do with your financial advisor, your insurance broker, okay, whoever it is that you work with to handle your specific situation, okay? So this is general information that you can use to answer this question: what insurance do I need, if I were, asking the question myself. Okay. So, as always, I just noticed the metaphor I've got here. This is a field, right? It's got to be fertile for planting, right? So the 3 pillars of attainment is really that methodology, perhaps we call it, for determining how are we going to use the fertile ground that is each one of us to live the most wonderful life, the life that we most want to live. Okay, this is the 3 pillars of attainment is really a way of thinking about the various questions we ought to be asking in order to figure that out. Okay, so I'm not going to get into it in depth. There's a whole show on my YouTube channel that talks about that. I invite you to take a look at it. With insurance, of course, we're dealing, as we always do in people making money. Oops, there it goes backwards. We're dealing primarily in the pursuits pillar and in the finances realm. However, it's going to impact health. It's going to impact family. And perhaps, some of the other things, plague comes to mind, as you'll see toward the end of today's episode. Okay, so let's get into now the meat of what we're going to talk about. So there are, for all intents and purposes, 2 major categories of insurance. Okay, one is life, health, and disability, and the other is property and casualty. Now, as the names say, they're dealing with, in a way, 2 different realms of our lives. Okay, so life, health, and disability is dealing with our physical well-being or lack thereof, right? I mean, life insurance presumably is there, well, not presumably, life insurance is there, right, for when we pass away, okay? But it's still dealing with our physical well-being. Property and casualty insurance, on the other hand, is dealing with our property, okay, and accidents that can happen because of it, to it, those kinds of issues, okay? So as we get further into the presentation, you'll see how these 2 categories work out in practice. Now, another reason for identifying these 2 categories for you is there are insurance brokerages that are comprehensive and they handle all types of insurance in both categories. But there are other types of insurance brokerages that only handle one or the other. Okay, so for example, you if you're dealing with a life insurance agent, okay, typically that person will not deal with property and casualty insurance. Now, their company may have a program, and you call a number and you'll talk to a property and casualty agent. but your life insurance agent probably doesn't have much, if any, background and knowledge in the property and casualty sector. Okay. As well, in some states, it requires different licenses to sell these two different categories of insurance. Okay. So you may have someone who has a life insurance license. Trying to think of, I believe Virginia is a state like this. So someone who has a life insurance license in Virginia, that does not permit them to sell property and casualty insurance. That's a separate license. So they have to have both in order to advise you and sell both types of insurance. So that's another distinguishing characteristic between the two. And why is there a separate license in some states? It's because the issues that are dealt with in the two different categories are significantly different. Okay, so it takes a separate body of knowledge in order to advise people appropriately in these two categories. Okay, so we're going to start out and we're going to talk about the types of insurance under the life, health, and disability category. And then we're going to talk about insurance under property and casualty category. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of others that don't really fall into either. They, and they're not the most common. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's not that they're not the most common. It's that they tend to be, I don't know, afterthoughts, maybe. Perhaps that's the best way to explain it. Okay. So let's get into this now. All right. So under life, health, and disability, I'm going to talk about 4 types of insurance. And I would say in order of their importance, okay, generally speaking. Now again, your specific situation may require a different priority of coverages, okay? So this is not meant to apply to you specifically. This is general information, okay? Having said that, health insurance in the life, health, and disability category is probably the most important insurance that we should have, okay? And I would say most of us are probably familiar with health insurance, whether we have an HMO with something like Kaiser, whether we have a PPO through maybe Blue Cross, Blue Anthem, okay? Health insurance is there to defray the cost of staying healthy, right? Now, there's a huge, huge range in types of plans. Okay, there are some plans that only cover so-called major medical, like, surgeries and those kinds of very expensive procedures, but otherwise they have very high deductibles and higher copays. So for your kind of routine medical care, most, if not all of that is going to be paid out of your own pocket. But as a result, the cost of the major medical health plan is relatively low. Okay. And then there are health plans that have very broad coverage, very low deductible, low out of pocket. Okay. And they cover, in some cases, virtually everything. Okay. So when I was still in the military, I had insurance through what's called TRICARE. That's the government military health insurance system. And through TRICARE, I mean, it was virtually 100% coverage for everything. I don't even think I had copays, if I recall. I think for my family at the time, we had a family deductible, I want to say, of about $300, maybe something like that. Okay. And then 100% of everything else was covered. Okay. So, I mean, it was as Cadillac, as they call it, healthcare as you could get. Especially since I didn't live near a military facility, so I didn't have to go on base to get my health care because the nearest base was more than an hour away, right? So I could basically go to my regular doctors and everything was paid for. Now, the premiums for a family at the time were around I want to say $300 a month, maybe $500 a month, still far, far, far less expensive than anything that was available in the civilian insurance marketplace. Okay. So now, and it is the case that government provided insurance plans tend to be better in terms of what they cover and how much they cover, et cetera, than private sector plans. Union plans tend to be better than other types of private sector plans. Okay. So these are all things to keep in mind, okay, when you're dealing with health insurance, right? Also, what categories of health does it cover? So does it cover medical? It probably covers. Does it cover dental? Does it cover eye care? How does it cover prescription medications, right? How does it cover medical devices? All of these things, okay, go into a healthcare plan. So, you know, if you're not sure what your plan covers, then if you have an employer sponsored plan, right, you should be able to talk to your benefits manager and they'll be able to tell you. Okay. If you don't have healthcare, right, you can go to healthcare exchanges now and you can get healthcare through the exchanges. In some cases, you may qualify for a subsidy in order to get healthcare insurance. Okay. The main thing is, for most of us, this is probably if we don't have any other insurance, health insurance is probably the one that we want to have for ourselves and our families. Okay. Now, the next type of insurance is disability insurance. So some states, for example, California, have something called SDI, State Disability Insurance. Okay. And as an employee, okay, your I don't recall now if your employer or you actually pay the SDI tax, but in any event, that SDI tax is paid, and therefore you are entitled to get disability coverage from the state of California. Now, I don't think all 50 states have SDI, but probably most of them do. Okay, so the question is, how extensive is that disability coverage? So if you get hurt, and by the way, disability can be temporary, it can be permanent, okay? And the Social Security also has a disability program as well. That's part of the overall Social Security scheme, if you will, okay? So looking at that disability coverage, is that enough to sustain your lifestyle if you had to rely on that in lieu of your income, in lieu of your salary? Okay, so that's something that you're going to want to investigate. Okay, these state plans are, I mean, they provide, you know, reasonably decent benefits, but you know, if you live in a high cost location like Los Angeles, like New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago, okay, what you get may not be enough to sustain your lifestyle. In which, and by the way, if you are self-employed, so if you're a gig worker, for example, or you're self-employed in the sense of, you know, you do, you know, contract work for this person, that person, whatever, okay, you may not be covered under a state disability insurance plan. Okay, so in that case too, you may need to look at private disability insurance. Now, the thing about disability insurance is the older you are, the more expensive it is to get this coverage. Okay, so it's one of those things that you're probably less able to afford it when you're younger and you have a more limited income. On the other hand, the sooner you can get started with disability and potentially lock in your premiums, the better off you'll be down the road. Okay, so with disability insurance, Okay, this is not the first thing you want to buy. The first thing you want to do is find out, am I covered for disability through the government or through my union or through, some sort of professional association? Do they have a disability insurance plan? Okay. And if the answer to that question is yes, then how much coverage do you have? And what does it take to become eligible? Is there a waiting period? Do you have to be disabled for 90 days before it kicks in? Something like that, okay? So check out all those things to see, how will the disability insurance work? And is it going to allow you to continue living how you're living now with the income that you have? Okay. And if it does, you're in good shape. So this is not, you don't have to buy private disability insurance. Now, if you don't have any kind of disability insurance, okay, or what you can access through the state or through your union or whatever isn't enough, so then you may want to look at additional private disability insurance coverage. Okay. All right. So that's disability insurance. I want to keep an eye on the time here. Next is long-term care insurance. Now, this is different than disability. Okay. So let's say that, God forbid, you're injured in a way where you need long-term care, maybe in a nursing home, maybe in some kind of congregate care facility, maybe at-home care. Okay. So it's not only that you're disabled, okay, you need ongoing long-term health care. Okay, that's different than health insurance care. Okay. And again, the older you get, the more likely it is that you may need long-term care. Okay. So, to the best of my knowledge, there's no government program, certainly not here in California, for long-term care insurance. Now, are you covered for long-term care through your employer? Maybe. If you're a union member, are you covered through your union? Maybe. Okay. That's something you need to take a look at. Okay. Now, I know in the military, if someone was injured while on active duty, for example, and it required ongoing health care, so they might be transitioned out of the military, but they would retain healthcare services for that injury or whatever it was that was sustained while they were in the military. Okay, but that's not necessarily true of other government insurance. Okay, so you may need to get long-term care insurance. Okay, now the thing about long-term care insurance that is kind of similar to disability is that the earlier, the younger you get it, the less expensive it will be. So if you're going to try and get long-term care insurance for the first time when you're 65 or 70, the cost is going to be very high, most likely. On the other hand, if you first get long-term care insurance when maybe you're in your 30s, it's probably going to be much more affordable. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that therefore you can't afford it. You may not be able to. Okay. So you also, examine your overall health, examine the health of members of your family, especially older members. Did they live a long time? And did they live pretty healthy lives? Did they spend lots of time in nursing homes and that kind of thing? Those are some of the questions that you're going to want to investigate before you decide whether you need to get long-term care insurance. Okay. But keep in mind, one of the scary parts of being sick is running out of money for the healthcare that you need, right? So that's why long-term care insurance is there. Okay. Just as an aside, I've had long-term care insurance now for, 20 some odd years. Okay. So I first got it when I was in my very late 30s or early 40s. I don't recall exactly now. And so my cost is pretty low. And in my case, it has a rider on it that each year they'll bump up the amount that I get by an inflation factor. Okay, it bumps the premium up a little bit, but what I'm paying for my long-term care insurance now is far less than it would have been if I went to try and get the coverage now, okay, as someone in his early 60s. Okay, so again, something to look into. You may not need to get it right away, okay, but you may want to educate yourself about it so that you can make an informed decision. Is this something I really need to take a serious look at, or is this something I really don't need? Okay, it's a bigger financial burden perhaps now than I really want to bear given my other priorities. Okay, now, by the way, if you have huge assets, okay, and you're not concerned about running out of money, then you may not need long-term care insurance. I mean, you may not. By the way, you may not need disability insurance either. Okay, if you've got tons of assets, so then it may come down to, if you can support yourself without working, do you really need to pay insurance premiums for these other types of coverages, okay, that are there in essence because you can't work and or need ongoing, somewhat costly or very costly healthcare? Okay, so you can, what we might call, self-insure, in the sense that you've got big assets, and so you don't need to necessarily pay for an insurance policy in these areas. Okay, all right. Last in the category of life, health, and disability is life insurance. Okay, now I did a show on life insurance. I think it was I want to say quite a few weeks ago. Okay, and I talked about the different types of life insurance, why you should have it, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not going to go in as much detail today as I did in that particular episode, because you can always go and watch that if you want to get into more of the you know what? I take that back. It was not a show. I wrote a newsletter about life insurance. That's what it was. Okay, so life insurance comes in basically first of all, let's talk about what life insurance is for. Life insurance is there to make sure that if you die, your family, or whoever your beneficiaries are, can continue their lives financially in your absence. Okay, so let's say you're a man, you have a wife and 2 children, okay, and you provide, I don't know, 2/3 of the family income. Okay, if you die, how is your family going to continue to live with your loss of income? Well, you may say, well, I'm not going to be there, so it's not going to cost them as much. Well, that's true. Okay, but their housing cost probably isn't going to decline just because you've passed away, unless they, get smaller housing or something. Okay, yes, less food, but many of the expenses of supporting a family are fixed, in the sense of whether there's 4 members of the family or 3 doesn't make a big difference. So for a family to lose 2/3 of its income would make it very difficult for that family to survive. So life insurance is there, in essence, to compensate for the loss of that income. Okay, now there's a couple of ways to look at it. One is to provide some temporary funding while the family sort of rejuggles itself to be able to live with you not there any longer. Okay, and another is to provide what amounts to a permanent replacement for your income. Okay, so let's say that you are making $100,000 a year. Okay, if you were going to do kind of a stopgap measure, so you might consider getting, say, $200,000 of life insurance, and that will allow your family to go for 2 years without your salary and get themselves kind of reorganized so that they can live going forward without your salary. Okay. Another way you could look at it is to say, well, let's see, I was making $100,000 a year. If I get $1.5 million policy, okay, and then that policy, when it pays off, is turned into what amounts to an annuity at about, say, 6%. So that's going to throw off an income of about $90,000 a year in perpetuity, as long as the $1.5 million is there. Okay. And so you've replaced your income essentially permanently. Okay. As long as the $1.5 million in capital from the insurance policy paying off stays intact. Okay. So in the first case, the benefit of the policy is going to be spent. In the second case, the benefit from the policy is going to be invested, and only the interest thrown off from it, or the return thrown off from it, is going to be spent, but the principal is going to be kept intact. Those are basically two of the basic ways that life insurance can be used in order to help your beneficiaries stay financially stable after you have, as Shakespeare says, shuffled off this mortal coil. Okay, so there are basically two categories of life insurance. There's term life insurance, and then there's all the others, which are basically life insurance with some kind of investment plan built in. Okay. Term insurance is just that. You're buying it. It's very much like automobile insurance. Okay, in the sense that you pay a monthly or a quarterly or an annual premium, and as long as the premium is paid, the coverage is in force. If you stop paying the premiums, basically the policy will get canceled at some point and the coverage goes away. Okay, you don't build any equity in a term life policy. It's there purely for financial protection. Okay, and I would argue, most prudent financial advisors would say that's what life insurance is for. Okay, life insurance, when they talk about it, they really mean term life insurance, the ability to replace lost income. Now, on the other type of life insurance policies, whether they call it variable life insurance, universal life insurance, variable universal life insurance, I mean, there's all kinds of names. Whole life is another type in the other category of insurance. All of these essentially share a couple of characteristics. One is they have embedded in them what amounts to a term life policy. And in addition, part of the premium you pay is put into an investment account. Now, it may be the master investment account of the insurance company, or it may be an individual investment account that you start. It depends on the type of policy. Okay. And as a result, the life insurance policy can build up equity, meaning a value to that policy can be built up. When the policy matures, you'll get that equity. You can also borrow against it, but you're going to pay interest if you borrow against the equity in your policy. Okay. And you can, in some cases, sell the policy and get your equity out as well. So the question comes down to, and this is kind of an argument in the financial services business. There are certain companies that will say, never, if you're going to buy life insurance, term life insurance is the only kind to buy. So buy term, and whatever additional premium you might have paid for some other more elaborate type of life insurance, just invest that directly in an investment account. Okay. Other people say, no, 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 that's a breach of fiduciary duty to say that, because some people, whole life or universal life may be the right choice for them. Okay. I'm not going to get into that argument today, because it really comes down to perspective. What does someone see life insurance, or I shouldn't say perspective, I mean philosophy. What does someone see the purpose of life insurance being? Is it to replace income, as I've been talking about? Or is it to replace income, but also build itself up as an asset? And if so, is that the best way to do it? Okay, so if you're talking to a life insurance agent, these are the kind of questions you're going to want to ask. Okay, and I would encourage, especially if they're talking to you about something other than term insurance, I would encourage you to ask, okay, how much of the premium I'm paying is actually going to pay for the insurance? And how much is going to be invested? And if I were to get a separate term policy, would the insurance premium be higher or lower than the premium part of the more complex insurance policy? Do you see what I'm saying? Okay. Those are the kind of questions to ask. The additional amount of money in the more complex life insurance, what kind of return will I get? How much access will I have to that money? Could I put it in a mutual fund instead? And would I end up better off doing that? Okay, these are the kinds of questions that need to be answered if you're going to consider some kind of life insurance policy other than term life. Okay, so these are the four most common type of life insurance policies. Now, by the way, with life insurance too, as I mentioned, with disability and long-term care, if you have a substantial net worth, okay, you may not need life insurance. Okay, if you're already worth $1 million, $2 million, $4 million, something like that, you may not need life insurance. What is it that you're trying to replace? Okay, if you've got a couple $1 million in assets already, you could probably replace your income, okay, with just the assets that you have on hand, okay, without defraying the assets. Okay, so in that case, paying for life insurance may not make any sense. You're better off investing that money and continuing to build your wealth rather than using it to insure your life in the event that you die and now your family has to replace your income. Well, if you've got significant wealth, so then may not be an issue. Okay, so that's another thing to discuss with an agent is, do I even really need life insurance? Okay, so please keep that in mind as you consider your specific situation. All right, so these are the four most common types of life, health, and disability insurance. Let's move on to the second category now. Okay, property and casualty. Now, you're going to, just like with the previous category, probably you're familiar with automobile insurance, okay? If you drive, you're required to have automobile insurance, okay? Certainly that's the case here in California. I believe it's the case in all 50 states, okay? Now, automobile insurance is a type of property and casualty insurance in that it's there so that if you get in an automobile accident, a casualty, there will be money there to pay for the damage, whether it's damage to property or whether it's damage to people. Okay. Now, there are several parts potentially to an automobile insurance policy. So first of all, there'll be liability. Okay, liability is if you hit someone and you're liable for damages to them, it'll pay for the damages. There's comprehensive. If you get in an accident and it's your fault, how are you going to pay to have your car fixed? Well, comprehensive coverage covers getting your car repaired. Okay. Whereas if you get hit, the person who hit you, their insurance should pay for your car to be repaired. But if you hit someone, and the accident is determined to be your fault, okay, your liability coverage is not going to pay for your car to get fixed. I'm sorry, not comprehensive, collision. Collision will repair your car. Okay. And then you have comprehensive coverage. And now I'm going up on what comprehensive is. Okay, but there's comprehensive coverage. There may be towing. There may be medical coverage. Okay, that the medical coverage applies specifically if you get into an automobile accident, so that you don't have to necessarily access your health insurance for that. Okay, so there can be several types of coverages within an auto insurance policy. All right. And part of the policy too deals with what are your coverage limits. So the higher your net worth, the higher your limits may need to be. Okay. Now, if you have no assets, you're what's, sort of tongue in cheek in legal circles called judgment proof, because somebody can sue you and they can win, but you have no assets. So they're not going to get anything from you. Okay. And so if you have big, huge limits on your insurance policy, all that's happened is you're paying a lot of premiums so that if you get into an accident, the person gets a bigger chunk of money. Okay, but if you're not protecting any assets, you may not need real high coverage limits. Okay, so that's something to look at when you're dealing with automobile insurance. You may also want to get uninsured or underinsured motorist coverage. Now, that's very useful if you get in an accident. It's the other person's fault, but they don't have insurance, or they don't have enough insurance to take care of how you've been damaged. So then your policy will kick in and cover the difference. Okay? So if you live in an area where there's a lot of uninsured motorists, okay, for sure, you want to consider getting uninsured motorist coverage in your auto insurance policy. Okay, I'm not going to go into anything more than that. Presumably, most of you are familiar with automobile coverage. Okay, so we're just going to leave it at that. Okay, next, homeowners or renters insurance. Okay, and they're just what they describe. If you own a home, you need to have homeowners insurance. If you rent the place you live, you can't get homeowners insurance because you don't own it. But renters insurance can be extremely important for a number of reasons. Okay. Number one, if you get burglarized, okay, it's unlikely the owner of your building is going to be liable for you being burglarized. You need to cover your own possessions. That's one of the things renters insurance will do. It'll cover your possessions. Okay. Renters insurance typically also has a liability provision. So if you have some guests over and they trip and fall in your apartment, okay, or maybe you're renting a house, they trip and fall in your house, okay, your renters insurance will cover you for that liability. And depending on how the coverage is written, it may also, by the way, pay for insurance, pay for the cost of a lawyer defending you, okay, which can get pretty costly, okay? And in many cases, by the way, it's the cost of the defense that's so expensive, and so that even if you win, you could still be out, $100,000, $200,000 or more, right? So renters insurance can cover you for that as well. Some renters insurance has a limited amount of I'm going up on what it is. But if you have someone come in and do work let's say you have someone come in and mount some bookshelves, workers' compensation, that's what I'm looking for. It may have a limited amount of workers' compensation insurance, so that if you have someone coming in and doing a repair or something in your apartment, or you have someone coming in to clean your apartment, okay, they may be covered if they get hurt while they're working for you, okay? Now, homeowners insurance, it's just what it says. It's if you own a home, own your residence, okay? It could be a 2-unit, it could be a condo, could be a 3-unit building, okay? Not only does it cover all the things that I just mentioned under renter's insurance, but typically it's also going to cover damage to the building itself, okay? Depending on how that damage happened, okay? So if there's a fire, typically a fire would be covered, okay? If there's a flood, typically a flood wouldn't be covered. Flood insurance typically is an exception in a homeowner's policy that requires separate coverage, a separate flood insurance policy, okay? So when you're dealing with both homeowners and renters insurance, you need to look at the coverage carefully. What does it cover? What does it not cover? Okay, let's say you have a broken pipe, okay, and it sprays water all over the place, and the water, maybe the water damages, you have hardwood floors, and now the floors buckle, and you got a whole mess, okay? So you call the plumber comes in, they shut off your water, they have to replace a length of pipe, and $3,000 later, at least the plumbing is fixed, but now you've got damage to the property, the floor, the walls, or whatever, okay? Some homeowners policies will cover the damage to the floors and the wall, but they're not going to cover the source of the damage, the pipes themselves. Others cover both, okay? It depends on how the policy is written, okay? So these are the kinds of questions that you need to ask when you're securing these types of coverages. Okay, so I'm sure you've seen the commercials for like Allstate, State Farm, Farmers. Okay, historically these companies were property and casualty companies. I think all of them now have life insurance divisions as well. Okay, but historically, like, they covered auto, they covered homes, some of them had renters insurance. Okay. Just because they're a well-known carrier doesn't mean that they necessarily are offering you comprehensive coverage. Okay, so you need to look at the details to make sure you understand what all is being covered in a homeowner's or renter's policy. Okay. Having said that, if you're going to be driving, you need to have an automobile insurance policy. You can lose your license if you don't have one. But after that, if you have a home, and there's a loan on the home, your lender is going to require you to have a homeowner's insurance policy. Now, if you rent, your landlord may require you to have a renter's insurance policy. Some do, some don't. Okay. If you're not required to have one, you may not have one. And if you're, living on a tight budget, you just may not be able to afford it. Okay. On the other hand, if you don't have a lot of possessions, so then it may not be that expensive. It depends on the jurisdiction you're living, the zip code you live in, et cetera. Okay. So, do you absolutely have to have renter's insurance? It really depends on your specific circumstances. Okay. Now, but before I leave the topic of homeowners and renters insurance, there are certain types of property that you may have on your premises that are excluded from a typical homeowner's policy, or there's limits on how much will be covered. For example, jewelry. So if you have a lot of valuable jewelry on your, in your home, okay, your policy may only cover it up to $5,000 or something like that. And so you may need to get what's called a rider, which is an additional coverage specifically for the jewelry that you have. or you may need to, keep it locked up somewhere where it can't be stolen. Okay. The same is true of musical instruments, firearms, technology, computers, and that kind of stuff. Okay. Many of these types of properties, a typical homeowners or renters policy will have a limit or an exclusion, or will exclude them from coverage altogether. And so if you have any of these items that are particularly valuable, you may need to get either a separate policy for them, or you may need to get a rider on your homeowners or renters policy in order to make sure that they're covered. Okay. So some of you may be familiar with USAA. USAA has limits on like musical instruments. Okay. So when I was stationed in Okinawa, I had a musical instrument my father had given me, and I never really thought anything about it. And then I needed to have some repairs done on it. And so I actually shipped it back to the United States to have the repairs done. And when the fellow who was doing the repairs got it, he said, he sent me an email. He said, "Do you have any idea what this thing is worth?" I'm like, "No." And he said, "Yeah, it's worth at least X." I'm like, "Wow." He said, and the next thing he said was, "You may want to check your insurance because you're probably not covered." And indeed, I wasn't. But I could go onto the USAA website, and for a small additional premium, I could add a rider onto my renter's policy to make sure it was covered. Okay. And when I say small, I think it was, I don't know, like 10, 20 bucks, right? Because how likely was it that this, musical instrument was going to be stolen? Okay. But still, if it had been stolen, I would have been heartbroken. Right. So sometimes you need to deal with certain types of property, not necessarily separately per se, but in addition to your homeowners and renters policy. Let's see how we're doing on time here. Okay. All right. Let's move on. So identity theft. I don't even remember the statistics on identity theft. It's like tens of millions of people, I think, have their identity stolen every year. Okay. I've had mine stolen. It was an enormous headache. It took me 2 years to get everything fixed from it. Okay. So there are identity theft policies out there. Okay. There are things like LifeLock, which that's not really insurance, but it can help you prevent your identity being stolen. Okay. If this is a concern, it may not be the number one top priority, but if you can afford it, you may want to look into identity theft insurance. Okay. Now, there are all kinds of laws, rules, regulations about how much you can be held liable for if, if your identity is stolen and people use your credit cards without your authorization, all that kind of stuff. There's only so much you can be held liable for. All of that needs to be checked out within. There are certain laws that are national, but there are certain state laws as well. So you need to look within, where you're living to find out, do I really need identity theft coverage? Okay. Finally, I'm going to talk about something called an umbrella policy. Now, if you have substantial assets to protect, let's say you're worth a couple of $1 million. Okay. And let's say, you've got an automobile insurance policy and you've got pretty hefty limits on it. Maybe you have something like, 125, 250, 50,000 or something like that. Okay. So you get into an automobile accident, you're covered up to $250,000. Okay. But you've got assets worth $2 million. Okay. If the accident is your fault, and the person who hits you finds out you have substantial assets, guess what? They're going to sue you to try and get some of those assets. Okay. So you may need to get what's called an umbrella policy, which covers you for liability on a whole range of potential issues. It could be an automobile accident. It could be someone slipping and falling in your house. All kinds of different potential casualties could be covered by that umbrella. Okay. And it typically will cover you no matter where you're located. Okay. So maybe you live here in, Los Angeles where I do, but you're on vacation in Texas and you get into an automobile accident there. the umbrella typically will cover you for any liability you have there as well. Okay. Now, an umbrella policy, like if you don't have a lot of assets, it's unlikely you're going to need an umbrella policy. Okay. But if you have substantial assets, that's really something that you're going to want to take a look at and see if it makes financial sense. Okay. All right. So I'm not going to get into them any much more than that, but just I want you to be familiar with that concept because we're also, we got about 5 minutes here. Okay. So those are the four most common types of property and casualty insurance for an individual and a family. All right, now a couple of others I mentioned that I said I would talk about toward the end, and that is pet insurance and travel insurance. So veterinary care can be very expensive these days. Okay, I know when my dog Jiggers was still alive, he had to have operations 2 or 3 times to remove kidney stones. Okay, and each one cost anywhere from about $800 to $1,500. Okay, now I didn't have pet insurance back then. If I were to get another pet, I think I would probably consider getting pet insurance. Okay, because like I said, pet healthcare can be very expensive. Okay, and the reality is we love our pets, and if we are going to have to do some kind of expensive medical procedure, insurance may make sense in the same way that we have health insurance, for ourselves. Okay. I candidly am not familiar with terms in pet healthcare insurance policies. I have seen a couple of them over the years. But it is something I just want to kind of put the bug in your ear if you do have a pet. I mean, I've heard of things, by the way, insurance policies for pets to get mental health care. I have to say, I do think that's a little nuts, but I've heard of them. I don't know that I've ever seen one of those policies. Maybe it's an urban legend. Okay, but I guess if you're going to send your cat to a shrink, which I can't imagine giving mental health care to a cat, but whatever. But in any event, if you have a pet, especially a beloved pet, then that may be something you want to consider. Travel insurance, it's been around for a long time. You see the travel insurance dispensers, I think, still at airports, and it's exactly what it says. Well, there's a couple types of travel insurance. One is like travel casualty insurance, but you can also, like, if you're going to take a trip, but you're concerned that for some reason you may not be able to go on the trip and you're going to lose your money. So then you can get travel insurance that will pay you back some or all of the cost of the trip if you have to cancel a ticket that's non-refundable. Okay. I think sites like Priceline and such offer it when you buy a ticket. I haven't traveled in a long time, but my recollection is, they'll offer it. And again, it really comes down to your particular situation. Are you, absolutely certain you're going to go on this trip? Is there a chance it may get canceled? Has your health not been great? And so there may be some kind of health thing that'll come up that prevents you from taking it. Well, maybe then it's worthwhile to spend the money for the travel insurance. Okay. But it's just, again, something to keep in mind. Especially if you do a lot of traveling, so then you probably want to be familiar with it, so whether it's something that you want to deal with each time. All right. So that's 10 different types of insurance. Okay. If you have any questions, you can contact me at our various social media outlets, as well as you see my email address there. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, including if you need a financial advisor. I'd be happy to introduce you to somebody who can help you. And if you have questions, comments, good, bad, whatever, feel free to post them. If something you're asking isn't personal and may have kind of broad applicability to, to a lot of people. That's somewhat redundant. Please, post it so that other people can see the question and my response to it, because that'll help them out as well. And we'll all, learn even more together. Okay, so that's and all of these will be in the show notes as well. Oops, and I'm not sure what happened here. Okay, there you go. Here's all the legal stuff, and that ends it. And let's go ahead and stop the sharing. So that is my show for today. Your insurance primer, if you will. What insurance coverage do you really need? I want to reiterate this before we end, and that is, while I went through 10 different types of insurance coverage, I do not mean to imply by any means that you need all 10. Okay, you may only need a couple out of that list, or you may only be able to afford a couple. You may not be able to afford any of them right now. That's understandable. Those are look. When I was first out of college, I didn't have health insurance, couldn't afford it, and I didn't work for an employer who provided health insurance. I just didn't. So if I got sick, I took care of myself, as best I could. Okay, and eventually I got to the point where I could afford health insurance. And then when I started my company more formally, I had health insurance, I had disability insurance, I had long-term care insurance, I had life insurance, and then I had all of the business insurances, which we didn't even talk about today. So over time, as your finances improve, so it may be prudent for you to consider and or get more types of insurance than you had before. Okay. On the flip side, as you get more affluent, certain types of insurance that maybe you carried before, you don't need anymore, like life insurance. Okay. So you do want to be reviewing this subject periodically. I would say at least once a year, or once every 2 years at the least, at the least frequent. Okay. So, your circumstances change. And, it's like if you're single, but then you get married, you want to, look over you want to do an insurance review. If you have a child, you want to do an insurance review. Okay. If there's a substantial change in your wealth, you probably want to do an insurance review. And I want to reiterate, that doesn't mean you necessarily need more insurance. It may mean that you don't need a particular type of insurance anymore, and it would be better to take that money and invest it rather than spend it on insurance premiums. Okay, it all depends on your individual circumstances. So there you have it. Again, if you have any questions, comments, please feel free to let me know. And that's our third and final show of the Way to Wow shows for this week. So we will start again next week on Monday at 10 a.m. with Trusts and Estates Weekly, Tuesday at 11 a.m. with Business Lessons from the Military, and then a week from today on Wednesday at 12:30 p.m. These were all Pacific times, by the way, will be the next edition of People Making Money. So I thank you very much for joining me. Thank you for watching. And one last thing before I let you go, if you are not already a subscriber to our YouTube channel, please do consider subscribing. That way you will never miss an episode. You'll always know when new ones come out. Thanks again. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the week, and signing off. Marie, darling, you are my inspiration. You are my bell. All the best, folks.